Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you're well today. Today we're going to talk about the philosophical temperaments of INFJs. I was initially thinking of continuing the series of the 3 traits, applying it to philosophy and philosophical worldview and temperament. I'm still intending to continue with the series of the 3 traits. But when it comes to philosophy, I just thought, because I spent a lot of time reflecting on this issue, over the years. And I just think that speaking of the philosophical disposition of INFJs in general, without having to kind of carve it out into 3 distinct traits, actually would work better for this particular topic. But in future, when I discuss maybe 3 traits of INFJs in politics or 3 traits of INFJs in religion, because these have been suggested also by my Patreon supporters, whom I thank very much, I'll return to that, but to the schema. But in this video, we're going to talk about INFJs in general in relation to their philosophical worldview and temperament. Okay? Of course, there's variations. We're going to see that. But before then, 2 books I've written in the last couple of years. The Ecstatic Soul, my book on the INFJ, check it out, links below. And The Infinite Castle, my new novel. It may also interest you, and it's a very nice product. Both available for less than $10, both of them at the Amazon links in the description box. Check it out, and thank you to my Patreon supporters. Please support me. It helps the channel, keeps it going. Couldn't do it without you. 3 traits of, or rather, not 3 traits of the INFJ philosophical temperament. What is the INFJ philosophical temperament? What can we say about it? What are things that we seem to notice? So again, I'll start with a proviso. Whenever I generalize, it necessarily means that I am simplifying in some way, okay? And that there's always going to be at the margins some outliers, some INFJs who don't fit the description quite, okay? But my claim rather would be that what I talk about captures the majority, the generality of the INFJ temperament as relates to philosophy. I'll try also to not use too technical vocabulary, so that I don't lose you in the process. So what can we say about the INFJ temperament in philosophy? One thing that strikes me, when I observe INFJs across time, is an interesting combination of what I would call anti-materialism, anti-reductionism, and I'll return to these terms shortly, in the next stages, and a kind of history of fighting internally between a commitment to the world of spirit and a commitment to the world of human affairs in their everyday ordinariness. And usually either the world of spirit wins out at the end of the day, or the 2 worlds remain in perpetual tension, or finally, which in some ways is the preferred option, at least this is what my book claims, the Ecstatic Soul, but this is also, thinking that has carried forward in my mind since then, or the 2 become the object of a delicate but real reconciliation. So these will be the topics that I talk about. So if you're interested, please make yourself comfortable, and we're gonna do a bit of exploration. So first, the idea of anti-materialism. That one is rather straightforward on the face of it. If you rely on empirical observation, you'll notice that if you check famous INFJs, if you check INFJs in your environment, if you're an INFJ yourself, God, it's quite unlikely that you are a pure materialist, that you do not embrace the idea that the world in general, that we as human beings, as consciousness, are ultimately anything else than just bits of matter in motion, combined in various ways from which emerged biological processes, but where the idea that we have minds, that we have agency, that we have a relationship to the spiritual, at a higher, slightly more religious level, these are all kinds of stories we tell ourselves. Perhaps stories that are very useful in terms of helping to promote, the makeup and the good functioning of society and of ordered lives, but that are ultimately not based in, anything real. That really the fundamental stuff is the material. And you'll see here that this is actually quite closely connected with reductionism, although there is a difference in the sense that reductionism is something that is, I think, in some ways is even more antithetical to the INFJ mindset, because the difference between materialism and reductionism is that you can be a materialist, but you can be an emergentist materialist in the sense that you do believe that, for example, the biological and domain of life is not reducible to atoms in the void. But that, nevertheless, these are two very different, and ultimately incommensurable descriptions of a realm that is not a realm where thought, mind, spirit have any place. Okay. Now, to try to understand why that is the case is obviously a tricky aspect. I think, I deeply believe that one of the reasons why INFJs do not tend toward these views is because in the phenomenology of their everyday experience, their primary way of access to, that experience is introverted intuition. So the internal survey of unconscious contents, which is the primary prism through which INFJs experience reality. In some sense, because of inferior esse, the function that gathers data from the external world in the sense of the physical world is something that is always going to be through the lens of archetypes at some level. And the INFJs will not be aware of it. It will, to some strong degree, be a subconscious process, but it will be very difficult as a result for the INFJ to eradicate the idea that mixed in with the experience of the physical world is something that is profoundly non-physical and has to do with the fabric of consciousness, and underneath it with the architecture of the unconscious. Okay, so that makes INFJs peculiarly sensitive to two things. Number one, the ineliminable, impossible to eliminate nature and reality of the psychic, which here we will equate rather, roughly to the spiritual, to the mental, to the non-physical, So there is this such a deep and a deeply interwoven experience of this that INFJs are unmoved by portraits by philosophers or scientists claiming that's just the physical, right? Because it seems as if, again, in the phenomenology of their everyday experience, the slightest experience of anything, INFJs are in touch with something more. So that's the number one. But also a temptation to fall into a kind of reasoning that says, well, since everything is permeated with psyche, what if it's just psyche? What if there is nothing material, and that the material, objects that we see around us, the material world, the physical world, what if they're all just projections of that same psyche? Now, you'll see that it's a tempting move to make, not necessarily the right move to make, but a tempting one to make, particularly And this is where I move to this, tension between the spiritual and the physical and the INFJ's philosophical worldview, which is that the fact that the primary experience is so much permeated with spirit or psyche is also indicative of the fact that INFJs are more at home in experiencing the world in this way, including experiencing the difficulties they have with the everyday world of human relationships, the workplace, politics, getting out in the real world, extroversion, domains that are not the INFJ's strongest domains. An INFJ who has an experience of not thriving in those external domains is all the more likely to devalue them, and on the other hand, to strongly value where they think they excel. And it is possible and happens that as a result of this strong valuation opposed to a strong devaluation, what emerges eventually is a profound commitment to the pure reality of spirit. This might be articulated in some kind of philosophy or some kind of fictionalized thought or philosophy, or it may be lived through and only revealed if someone asked them the question. Now, this is something that in my book I sometimes refer as a strand of alienation. Okay, there's another strand of alienation, which is a recognition that the world of the material exists, that it's not just projection of our own psyches. It's a more commonsensical conception in some way, and yet a difficulty, a constant struggle experienced with the temptation to devalue this external world, this physical world. Whereas the other side, the psychic side, is never devalued. It's never a question. It's almost never devalued, which is also a corollary of the fact that INFJs are never materialists. Okay. Or again, in general, probably there are exceptions, but only outliers, exceptions. And so what you get is, in some sense, this tension state is less solipsistic than the pure psyche, pure spirit approach, but also paradoxically maybe more of a generator of dissatisfaction and an internal pain, because the tension is always experienced. There's a desire to just retreat to the purely spiritual, and yet almost a level of maturity and insight that forces them to admit that there is something also outside and that deserves our attention, makes a claim on us, and has to be engaged. Now, the more harmonious integration of these two aspects is the third type of worldview, which essentially says something like, psychic is where I originate, but my destiny is also to go out into the world, share my ideas, interact with other people, and follow my vocation, whatever it is. Often the vocation will be at least partly colored by this idea of sharing their ideas with other people and influencing other people. In some sense, the introverted INFJ just comes across a little bit here. Influence and mentoring, but more colored by psychic subjectivity in the case of the INFJ. Might be more depth that comes with it as well. It's always a little difficult because it usually requires a learning curve where the INFJ learns to become a bit less introverted. For those who were born quite introverted, because INFJs that were born not so introverted might experience fewer problems. But the relationship between embracing the world of social relations and that of ultimately making peace with the reality of a physical world, which is not inimical to their being, despite the fact that they come at it through a psychic lens originally, is probably the destination that is the most conducive ultimately to contentment, because the solipsism of the pure spiritual approach can make you very vulnerable in situations where you really have to deal with the material world, but you don't have the tools anymore because you're not supposed to even acknowledge that. And the second mode of constant tension, which will leave you more prepared than the solipsistic approach, but at the same time will always leave you in a perpetual state of frustration, deep philosophical frustration and existential frustration. So this third mode can take different forms. I used to think it had to culminate in a kind of monism where INFJs learned to appreciate that reality was a single thing that consisted in a mental aspect and a physical aspect. But I have come to think that it's possible to hold a more restful, content dualism as well, which I might tackle in a future video. But anyway, so I provided you with some clues as to what I think the fundamental philosophical worldview and inclinations of INFJs are. Would love to know what you think. Let me know in the comments, and don't forget you can support me on Patreon. See you tomorrow, guys. Bye-bye.